Hey, what's going on, guys? So, I wasn't originally going to make a whole video on this, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had something to say. And that is, I really like the Thunderbolts. More than I originally thought that I would. I mean, first of all, the initial premise was ridiculous at best. You have this team comprised of a super soldier, another a super soldier who I didn't even know was a super soldier, another super soldier, and an assassin who can walk through walls. And this team was going to come together to fight the Sentry, who is effectively Marvel's Superman. Or, one of them. So the whole premise just seemed kind of stupid. It was also weird that this was going to be a Thunderbolts movie, because the original concept behind the team was that it was a bunch of supervillains who were going to pull this long con and pretend to be superheroes to get the public's trust, and then they're going to do some bad guy shit. But then halfway through, they're like, I actually kind of unironically like being a superhero. This is kind of fun. Allegedly. I only just started reading the original run by Kurt Busiek with the Epic Collections. And the only other Thunderbolts book I've read is like the Warren Ellis series from Civil War, which was more or less Marvel Suicide Squad, where a bunch of supervillains were government-appointed superhero hunting Gestapo, which is a really cool premise, but within the context of the MCU right now, I don't know how you make that work. But the original idea of a bunch of supervillains cosplaying as superheroes, that's a really cool premise for a movie. But again, in the MCU, there aren't really any long-standing supervillains because they all die at the end of like every movie. So I just didn't know what to make of this going into it. Despite that, the trailers all looked pretty good. Like literally, this movie actually looked good compared to the past few MCU movies, which really just look like extended PS3 cutscenes at this point. And I liked the chemistry that the actors had with one another based off the trailers, and everything looked good, despite me still not knowing what to make of the movie. And a lot of it's also just bad faith. Again, the MCU's been in this ditch where I feel like they've been resting on their laurels, but like I said, at the end of the day, everything came together, and this movie's pretty good. The entire premise is that Valentina Allegra de Fontaine, who for the longest time I thought was an MCU OC, turns out she's from those old Jim Steranko S.H.I.E.L.D. books that I've tried to read, but I just can't do it. It's not my thing. But the version they use in the MCU, like almost everything else in this franchise, is apparently based on the Ultimate Universe, which apparently she's a character in Hickman and Asad Ribic's Ultimates, I guess. I mean, look, I haven't read that stuff in a long time, and I definitely don't remember her at all. But in the movie, she is the director of the CIA, and like all directors of the CIA, she's a walking crime against humanity. From human experimentation to bankrolling assassinations, coups, proxy wars, girl boss shit. But because of the events of Captain America 4, which I haven't seen yet, she is currently under impeachment. So she's covering her ass by deleting all evidence of her crimes, including having all of the assassins that she's hired fired, in the most literal sense possible. And that's essentially the plot of the movie. U.S. Agent, Black Widow, and Ghost are running away from Valentina, and that's the whole team-up angle here. And in their initial escape, they run into Bob, who is one of her experiments, who she later tries to rebrand as, like, her answer to the "Where is the Avengers" problem, as a one-man Avengers band as the Sentry. And their dynamic is like a diet version of Homelander and Stillwell from The Boys. But as soon as Valentina realizes that she can't control him, Sentry turns into the Void, and then starts turning all of New York into shadow people. And this is where this really crappy team of really crappy people do what they can to save New York, despite being the wrong people for the job. And right off the bat, this is probably the closest we're ever gonna get thematically to a cinematic adaptation of Mark Miller and Brian Hitch's The Ultimates, because the first Avengers movie, and I've been saying this for years now, is fun, but it's basically adapting Ultimates but with all of the irony sucked out of it. So instead of using superheroes as the framework to illustrate why the American military-industrial complex is a bad thing, the first Avengers movie is like, yeah, but they're good guys, so it's okay. This movie even does the thing from Ultimates where this horrible, ineffective team comes together to fix a problem that was created by a sociopathic career bureaucrat in the first place. And I get from a marketing standpoint why they're called the New Avengers, but given the subject matter and the way the story unfolds and the way the movie ends, I would have been fine if they were called the Ultimates. In fact, that could be their new name if Sam Wilson gets his way in court after suing them over the rights to the Avengers name. Also, I just love the hubris that the implication of that name bleeds, especially with them being a government-sponsored superhero team with a roster of government-funded super soldier experiments and a wild card demigod. I don't know, I personally think that would be pretty cool. But speaking on team names, I do appreciate why this movie was sold under the Thunderbolts moniker. Again, this is a team of genuine monsters. Like, yeah, they're sympathetic and all, but no. These are bad people, and they know that they're bad people, but they wish they weren't. And once they get a slice of that hero life, they're really into it. And that sort of speaks to the inherent concept behind the original Thunderbolts, I think. So that's something I walked out of the theater really appreciating. That said, and again, this is within the context of the MCU, the whole movie is about how these are bad people running away from their demons and trying to be more than the sum of their bad deeds, and them being the New Avengers is somehow a moral quagmire. But again, I know I keep saying this, but within the context of the MCU, I don't see how any of the people here are any worse than the original Avengers. And with the exception of Steve Rogers, Sam Wilson, and the Vision. Because everyone on that original team roster were also terrible people. Hawkeye and Black Widow were assassins. Tony Stark was an arms dealer. In that first movie, he is literally nicknamed the Merchant of Death. And that was a name that he wore as like a badge of honor. Thor is like 5,000 years old, and up until, in the universe 10 or 15 years ago, dude was a petulant, bloodthirsty, genocidal maniac. The Hulk obviously was the Hulk. Enough said. So I don't get how the New Avengers are somehow any less noble than the original Avengers. But I feel like tugging on that thread sort of breaks the movie, and I don't want to do that because I actually like the movie that we got. And speaking of things that I like, I really like Bob, which surprised me because I usually hate Bob. I hate the Sentry. I cannot stand that character. I hate whenever he shows up in things because his role in this movie is essentially his role in almost every comic that I've read him in, which isn't a lot, to be fair, but I've read enough to realize that I can't stand him because he shows up, does some cool Superman shit, and then immediately turns into the Void, making his psychosis everyone else's problem. Which works within the context of this movie, where the Void is a narrative device to illustrate grief and shame and depression and self-loathing, where our heroes have to literally overcome the darkness within themselves to save the world. That works within the context of a movie with a solid beginning, middle, and end. But when it's in every other comic event or crossover, that shit just gets tiring. I just don't like the Sentry. I cannot stand that character, and I'm glad he's dead. And I hope that he joins the ranks of Karen Page and Goliath and just never comes back. But again, I liked him within the context of the movie, and I thought he was pretty good here. But yeah, I like Thunderbolts quite a bit, or much rather, I like the New Avengers quite a bit. This is everything that I want from superhero movies. Because not everything has to be an end-of-the-world, World War III, or I guess at this point World War IV, multiversal epic of epic proportions. A lot of times, my favorite superhero comics are just character-driven emotional dramas that also feature grown-ass men and women in silly costumes. And it's cool that this was a character-driven emotional drama that also happened to feature grown-ass men and women in colorful costumes. I like that. More of that, please. from the MCU or just anyone else, assuming that live-action superhero movies are still going to be made in the near future. But those are just my thoughts. But what about you? Have you seen Thunderbolts yet? Are you planning on seeing the movie? If you have, let me know what you thought down below in the comment section. Also, if you like this video, hit the like button, share, support the channel, and if you want to see more content like this, all you gotta do is subscribe. I am the Mystical Green Beanie. Thank you for watching, and as always, until next time, take care. Peace.